Today we're going to talk about Squanto and his interactions with the Pilgrims. And the thing that you need to take away from this is that he is the single most important person when it comes to the survival of the Pilgrims. Without his help, we would not be talking about the Pilgrims. We would not be talking about Thanksgiving Day or anything like that. Without his help, they would have just been another group of English people that tried to make it in the New World and then just failed. That's the only discussions we'd be having about them now. Initially, it was not good news for the Pilgrims. They had left England on a ship called the Mayflower. It was a very small group, just over 100 people. And even that was 102 people, actually. And even in that group, not all of them were Pilgrims. Some of them were just people coming to America for a new life. They were trying to make their riches here. Really, as far as the Pilgrims, it's not much bigger than our classroom size. That's about the size of a group that we're talking about. It was really quite a small group of people. Now that first winter, they get here in October, and that first winter is particularly harsh on them because they're completely unprepared to survive for what was a wilderness. One half of them died during the first winter, and to make it even more difficult, the survivors were mostly children. So now you're left with a community. Half of them are dead, and now more of the survivors, more than half of them are children. So it's going to be hard to build a community when most of your community is either sick or they're children. Now again, what the reason for this, I say they were unprepared. If we look at the people who were on the ship on the Mayflower and what they brought with them, one person brought 126 pair of shoes and 13 pair of boots. It's a terrible thing to bring. You don't need those types of things. They brought very few animals. And remember, if you're going to pack and go live what's going to be a wilderness and create a new life for yourself, you have to choose very carefully what you're going to bring with you. Now, fortunately for the Pilgrims, they meet Squanto. Now, initially the Pilgrims are visited by a local Indian who's called Samoset. Now, Samoset had learned some words of the English language from English sailors and fishermen who had previously been in the area just coming by. Samoset did his best to communicate, but he had very limited English. So a week later, it was a friendly visit. A week later, Samoset brings Squanto with him. Squanto, all of a sudden, they realize he has just beautiful English. And they say, wow, how did you learn your English? Where did this come from? To understand that, you've got to understand Squanto's unusual life. He had lived a very unusual life. When the Pilgrims met him, Squanto was the only surviving member of a tribe called the Patuxent Indians. And Squanto had a deep connection to this area that the Pilgrims were living in because this used to be part of his village. In fact, the Pilgrims chose the area they did because the area already had been cleared. Just less than 5 years before that, it was a village with a number of Indians that were there, but they were no longer gone. And so anyway, that area was a very nice area for them to settle. Like I said, Squanto could speak fluent English. How did he learn this English language? When he was a young boy, he was kidnapped, and he was kidnapped by some Europeans. The Europeans took him over to Spain, and they wanted to sell them as slaves. But before they could be sold into slavery, some local Catholic friars rescued him and the others by convincing his captors that, hey, they were going to teach Squanto and the others about the Catholic faith. Squanto ends up convincing the friars to try to let him get home back to his people. He eventually travels on his way. He travels back to England, and it's there in England where he learns how to speak English. Now, he's a very well-traveled individual. In fact, in his lifetime, he travels through several different of the European countries, and he makes a total of 6 trips across the Atlantic Ocean in his lifetime. Now, the fate of Squanto's people, we talked a little bit about it. When Squanto finally gets back home, he finds that all of his people are dead. What had happened, they had been exposed to a European disease, which probably was smallpox. Now, this disease absolutely devastated the Indian population. Just a few years before this, his childhood community, it was a series of upwards to 20,000 people. But in a 5-year period of history, 90% of those people were dead. So his childhood community, it absolutely no longer exists. What was left were empty homes, the fields that were overrun with blackberries, and of course all the skeletons of those people that died from their sickness. Now, some historians have called this a huge cemetery, which I imagine it probably looked like that. It really was 200 miles long and 40 miles deep inland. This was an area where the disease had made such a strong impact on Squanto's people. Squanto is the one who actually ends up saving the Pilgrims. He is the first person that they run into that they have some hope that maybe he can help save them from starvation. Like I said, one half of them were already dead after the first winter. Those that had survived, the only reason that they had survived is they spent their time digging up graves and ransacking abandoned Indian homes looking for underground stashes of food. What Squanto does is he says, listen guys, if you're going to be here, you can't catch fish. This was what the Pilgrims thought they were going to do. They thought they would catch fish by the boatloads and then send them back to England and make their money that way. He says, listen, you can't do that. If you're going to live here, you have to learn how to farm. So he teaches them about corn. He teaches them proper fishing techniques and how to identify edible plants so that they can survive not by selling things, but by producing enough food for their survival. In addition to teaching the Pilgrims how to survive in their new surroundings, Squanto, he uses his translation skills to help negotiate a treaty between the Pilgrims and the remaining Indians. This treaty ends up being honored for more than 50 years and in fact is probably one of the greatest examples that there are of both sides of the Native Americans and particularly of the Americans honoring a treaty that was made with the Native Americans. This ends up being a double-edged sword. You know, it's great because there's peace, and what happens with this peace is more English are able to come to America now and to settle because of the relative peace. The double-edged sword, though, it ends up being ultimately historically catastrophic for the Indians because it's not long before the English now are outnumbering the Native Americans and continue to push farther west into their lands. But that's going to be a lesson for another day. Now you know about Squanto.